Daniel Hargrove, a smug bank teller, humiliated Amira Bennett by denying her access to her funds. Hours later, she walked in as his new boss, ready to expose his prejudice and confront the systemic racism in their bank. What happened next will leave you speechless. But let's start from the beginning. The buzzing atmosphere of Crestwood Savings Bank was a blend of monotony and urgency. Customers shuffled through the marble-tiled lobby, their conversations a low murmur against the backdrop of clicking keyboards and the steady whir of printers. The air was tinged with a faint aroma of coffee, lingering from a nearby break room. Overhead, fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow on the polished countertops and rows of impatient patrons. Daniel Hargrove, seated at the central teller station, radiated an air of superiority. His impeccably pressed shirt, paired with a sleek tie and cufflinks, was meticulously chosen to project an image of authority. His sharp features and slicked-back blonde hair gave him a polished appearance, but his demeanor told a different story. His pale blue eyes roved over the crowd, often settling on certain individuals with a look of thinly veiled contempt. Known among the staff for his biting remarks and dismissive attitude, Daniel relished any opportunity to assert his dominance. Amira Bennett stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. The soft swish of her tailored navy suit matched her composed stride, exuding confidence and poise. Her natural curls framed her face elegantly, and her polished leather heels clicked rhythmically against the tile as she approached the counter. Setting her designer handbag gently onto the surface, she slid her account card toward Daniel. "I'd like to access my account, please," she stated with measured firmness, her voice calm yet resolute. Daniel's lips curled into a faint smirk as he picked up the card. After a cursory glance, he flicked it back toward her dismissively. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "We've had some issues with accounts like yours. Suspicious activity. You'll have to come back later." Amira's eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse me? What sort of issues?" Leaning forward, Daniel lowered his voice. "Let's just say we have protocols for accounts flagged for certain reasons. You understand, right?" His words carried a thinly veiled insinuation, sharp enough to draw murmurs from nearby customers. Amira's expression hardened. Straightening her shoulders, she met his gaze directly. "I need access to my funds immediately," she demanded, her voice firm. Daniel leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with a smug grin. "Not possible," he replied. "Bank policy." Amira stood her ground, her composed demeanor beginning to give way to a simmering frustration. "Call your manager," she demanded, her tone clipped but resolute. The air around the counter seemed to tense, and a few curious customers nearby glanced over, sensing the escalating tension. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, his confident smirk faltering just enough to betray his unease. Begrudgingly, he pressed the button on his headset. "Assistant manager to counter 3, he announced in a monotone voice, though the edge of annoyance was unmistakable. Moments later, a wiry man in his late 40s appeared from behind the frosted glass doors leading to the office area. His tie was slightly askew, and his forehead glistened with sweat, a sign of a long day already filled with problems. "What's the issue here?" he asked, his gaze darting nervously between Amira and Daniel. Amira wasted no time. "I need access to my account," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "Your employee has refused to assist me and is withholding my funds without justification." Before the assistant manager could respond, Daniel cut in, leaning back in his chair with feigned nonchalance. "It's flagged, sir. Likely fraud. You know how these things go," he said, his tone laced with condescension. The assistant manager frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Well, ma'am," he began cautiously, "if your account is flagged, there's a procedure." "I am well aware of your procedures," Amira interrupted sharply, her eyes narrowing. "I've studied them extensively. Either you resolve this now, or I escalate this issue far beyond your pay grade." The assistant manager's face paled, and his discomfort turned to thinly veiled panic. It was clear he was suddenly unsure of who exactly he was dealing with. Daniel, however, was undeterred. He leaned forward slightly, a smug grin creeping back onto his face. "Good luck with that," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Amira to hear. Amira's gaze snapped to his, her expression as cold and sharp as a blade. "You're going to regret those words," she said, her voice low but brimming with icy conviction. Silence fell over the counter as the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. The midday hum of the bank quieted as employees filtered into the conference room, their chatter replaced by the faint creak of chairs and the rustling of papers. The announcement of an urgent meeting had piqued curiosity, but most assumed it was yet another routine update. Daniel Hargrove, ever confident, strutted into the room with his usual air of smug indifference, his smirk firmly in place. He greeted his colleagues with a casual nod, settling into his seat near the center of the table. His fingers drummed against the surface as he leaned back, clearly unbothered. Whatever this meeting was about, he was sure it wouldn't concern him. At the head of the table stood Amira Bennett, a vision of poised authority. Her crisp white blouse, paired with a sleek black blazer, contrasted sharply with the tense energy in the room. Her natural curls framed a face set with determined confidence, her expression unreadable but commanding. The room fell silent as she stepped forward and cleared her throat. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice firm and resonant, instantly silencing even the faintest whispers. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. I am Amira Bennett, your new regional director." The air seemed to shift, the weight of her announcement settling heavily over the employees. A ripple of murmurs passed through the group, quickly extinguished by Amira's steady gaze. Daniel, who had been casually reclining, froze mid-motion. His smirk evaporated, replaced by a wide-eyed look of disbelief. He could feel the weight of his colleagues' stares, many of them darting between him and Amira, their expressions a mixture of amusement and anticipation. Amira's gaze swept across the room, pausing ever so slightly on Daniel. Her eyes locked with his, just long enough to make his collar feel too tight. He squirmed, his earlier bravado now a distant memory. "I've spent the past week reviewing the operations at this branch," Amira continued, her tone measured but cutting. "And I must say, some policies and behaviors are in desperate need of correction." Her words were deliberate, her emphasis unmistakable. Daniel sank lower in his seat, his face pale. The tide had turned, and the room seemed to buzz with unspoken anticipation of what would happen next. Amira's arrival as regional director marked the start of a new era at Crestwood Savings Bank. Over the next few weeks, the office was a hive of activity, with employees undergoing intensive training sessions on customer service excellence and anti-discrimination practices. PowerPoint slides detailed ethical conduct policies, and role-playing exercises tested their ability to handle diverse customer scenarios. No one was exempt from these measures, and the seriousness of the effort set a clear tone. Mediocrity and prejudice would no longer be tolerated. To ensure every voice was heard, Amira implemented anonymous feedback surveys. The results were telling. Patterns emerged, highlighting numerous complaints about Daniel Hargrove's behavior. Dismissive attitudes, biased comments, and unprofessionalism. Amira used these findings to put him on probation, setting a precedent that even the longest-standing employees were not above accountability. One morning, as the office buzzed with its usual rhythm, Daniel sat at his desk, his mood dour. Gone was his usual air of self-assuredness, replaced by a slouched posture and a distracted gaze. He barely looked up as Amira approached, her heels clicking against the tile floor. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, her tone crisp yet restrained, the kind of professionalism that carried an unmistakable edge. He glanced up, his face immediately flushing. "I've reviewed the incident from last week. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Daniel stammered, his words faltering. I didn't realize." "That I was your boss?" Amira interjected, her eyebrow arching slightly. "It shouldn't have mattered. Your actions were unprofessional and rooted in prejudice. This is your formal warning. Step out of line again, and you'll find yourself unemployed." The color drained from Daniel's face. He nodded weakly, barely audible as he mumbled, "Yes, ma'am." Amira turned sharply on her heel and strode back toward her office, her head high. Behind her, murmurs of approval grew into a ripple of applause. Both employees and customers in the lobby, having witnessed the exchange, showed their quiet support for her leadership. For the first time in weeks, Amira allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Justice, she thought, was indeed a dish best served cold, and in a tailored suit.